Over the next 30 minutes, I'm very much hoping I'm going to be able to extract some brilliant ideas as to how we can engage better with business, with education, and also outreach to ourselves across the world. Hello, I'm delighted we've got an outstanding panel from all over the world brought together to consider outreach and engagement in the National Geospatial Agencies. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm very much hoping I'm going to be able to extract some brilliant ideas as to how we can engage better with business, with education, and also outreach to ourselves across the world. So perhaps I could ask the panel to first introduce themselves.
Thank you, Vanessa. My name is DeLoach, and I serve as the Executive Director for the Federal Geographic Data Committee in the United States, where we have the responsibility for the development of the national spatial data infrastructure in the U.S. And for us to do that effectively, communication and outreach is critical. We have the responsibility for coordinating with 32 federal agencies, as well as our state and local governments and a suite of other stakeholders. So in order to do that, we really have to take significant steps in ensuring that the policies that we're developing are policies that will be effective, but also will be beneficial to folks. So our most recent strategic plan has laid out a key goal for communication, where we're taking steps to take advantage of social media, conducting a series of workshops and forums, but more importantly, doing outreach where we can hear what the people that we're impacting have to say about the work that we're doing. So most recently, we had a forum in Washington where we invited about 15 representatives from key associations and trade organizations in the U.S., where it was very enlightening in terms of their viewpoint and some of the policies that we're developing, I should say. And it really provided us with some insight in terms of how to refine those policies, where they make those more effective in terms of the impacts, especially around standards development, as well as the ability to use the technology itself.
Excellent. Barb, can I turn to you, and perhaps you could introduce yourself and talk a little bit about some of the outreach you've been doing?
Yeah, I'd be happy. Thank you very much. My name is Barbara Ryan, and I'm Director of the Group on Earth Observations, or GEO, Secretariat in Geneva, Switzerland. We are an intergovernmental organization, so we have member states of the United Nations, and also participating organizations and emerging involvement with the private sector. So we are very intent on bringing this community together, all the different players or actors in the community, to in fact reinforce and support the work that's going on in national mapping agencies, but also what I would call any national geospatial agencies or Earth observation agencies. So they could be meteorological agencies, hydrologic agencies, space agencies, and we're really interested in bringing kind of the convening power of GEO together, because it really does take each of these individual communities playing their own role, but working together collaboratively if we want to move this entire field forward, and that's what we're interested in doing.
Thank you. Greg, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. I'm Greg Scott. I'm based in New York in the United Nations. I actually head up the Secretariat on what is known as the United Nations Global Committee of Experts on Global Geospatial Information Management. It's a bit of a mouthful, but we'll call it UNGGIM. And in essence, it's intergovernmental, a bit like the Group on Earth Observations, but very much driven by the member states, as many UN committees and processes are. One of the unique features about UNGGIM is that it's actually represented by the heads and the lead organisations of the National Geospatial Agencies from around the world, from each of the 193 member states. But critically too, when it was established by ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, in 2011, is that it also engages with industry and the private sector. And it does that because of the recognised pervasiveness and ubiquitous nature of geospatial information, its role that it plays across governments from a national through to a regional and a global level. And a key factor behind the establishment of UN GGIM is being so that geospatial agencies can have a voice. And this is really important in terms of outreach and communication in global topics. So the topic we're talking about today is very close to the heart of what UN GGIM is trying to achieve as well.
Excellent. Well, I would like to sort of put a bit of challenge to you now, because I've heard each of you say, we're doing it, and I'm absolutely sure from what I've seen, you're doing it really very successfully. But yet, many of us have challenges every day to explain to anyone what geospatial is and how it can benefit the economies of regions, of nations, of the globe, how it can benefit in the sustainability development agenda, how it can benefit in crime management, so many different areas. So often that word geospatial, we're finding people don't really understand. So, I'm delighted you're here, because you really have to be some of the world's leaders at this. So what can we do differently in, say, the next 12 and 24 months to really ensure that key decision makers, whether they be in governments or whether they be in the private sector, really get it?
I think you make some good points. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that when we talk about geospatial information, it's not a simple term for people to understand. And when we talk about other professional communities, and particularly the area that I come from in the UN, we talk about something as simple as statistics. People understand that. Yep. The people on the street understand it, but so do decision makers. With geospatial information, it's a bit more difficult because it's a lot more cross-cutting. And so sometimes the challenge is to communicate, what it is in terms of location, in terms of place, in terms of how you use it in your day-to-day lives, but also who that audience might be. And this is one of the big challenges, coming back to, okay, how do we make a difference over the next year to 2 years, and from the national to global perspective, is that it's really important that we consider, as we know our community very well, but we have to also consider and continue to consider and communicate languages to people in the language they need to hear, or terminologies in the language they need to hear. So, for example, within the UN system over the last, as you will know, the last year or so, and particularly the last few months, as the governments of the world have negotiated the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, a lot of discussion around geography has taken place, and thinking about sustainable development and with location. When we think about education, poverty, water scarcity, humanitarian needs, disasters, climate change, urbanisation, they all have a very geographic and location-based component. And part of the challenge for us is to communicate these messages in simple language, in simple terms, but also easily understandable, and takeaway messages that some of these decision makers can understand. It's then incumbent on us within the geospatial information community to then to message that and carry some of those messages through in terms of capability, in terms of capacity, and this knowledge transfer. And this is important when we think about some of our outreach as well. It's not easy. We've been doing this now for many years, but I think because of the nature of our global community now in understanding location, it's becoming easier, but it's still a journey, but a good journey to be on.
Now, Bob, you've got a very big summit coming up where you've got to try and get ministers from all around the world. I'd like to really understand how you're going to express to ministers who are slightly doubtful that they should get on the plane to come to Mexico to your ministerial summit. How are you going to express it? Because I think we can all learn on the use of language, whether we are perhaps in a state government where we have a function and we want to brief to a colleague, it's all about language. So as you're a world expert, how would you do that language? Because you might actually have somebody listening today who has actually got to do that job to try and persuade their minister to travel.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, and I guess maybe what I'd like to do is just build on Greg's comments a little bit too, because I think you're right. For many ministers, then just saying geospatial information doesn't mean anything to them, or it's just more difficult to understand. Maybe we had a better grasp when we thought about just maps and paper maps, and that, because I do think that this whole thing about the power of place is something inherent in all of us as individuals or as human beings. But where we lost something, I think, in moving away from maps is that tangible connection with place. And so the attempt to go or migrate towards geospatial information was to say we really can put so much more information, in this location-based context. And so I think we got there honestly enough by starting to call it geospatial information as compared to just our maps before. But from a group on Earth observations perspective, and particularly for a message for the ministers, one of the things that I think is very important to do, and this goes back to your next question about, well, what would you do in the next 24 months? Government agencies in particular need to continue to expose their data. Any data that is collected that is in fact location-based at government expense, that is, the taxpayers have paid for the people to collect the data, to stand up those institutions, for those sensors, then the taxpayers are actually entitled to that information that's derived from all of those systems, and it's good for the economy. And I think that's maybe the point that is most relevant for ministers, because what government in the world doesn't want to see its economy grow? And the fact that this geospatial information or map information can in fact facilitate industrial growth in your government, in your country, is essential. And also free up that information so that other government agencies can get access to what a different government agency is collecting. So there's no limit to what can be done with this information, because I think combining human ingenuity, this power of place, is something that we all share, no matter where you are on the globe. And we've just got to do a better job of communicating that energy or that power, I think, to ministers.
I think something's quite interesting following on from that. I will never forget going to see the head of the British government's Treasury, believing absolutely that they would be fully understanding the importance of our area. The person was incredibly bright, had clearly done his reading, and his summary to me was, Vanessa, I would like you to never use these long, complicated words ever again. And as a result, he said, come back in a week with a few catchphrases and something everybody can understand. And hence I came up with the idea that everything happens somewhere, which the UN has taken on and actually embellished a bit more. And I think your phrase is now, everything that happens somewhere. And basically I also turned around and said, we'll call it location decision making, place-based decision making, just because our complex language wasn't translating that well. But Ivan, you through FGDC and other things, you have to do a lot of engagement with business. And I'd be interested in hearing sort of from you how you think we can attract in the many, many new businesses, whether they be the small, medium enterprises or the very big corporates, getting the insurance companies, getting the banks involved?
Absolutely. We've come to recognize that we have to change our approach, and it does come down to language and what folks understand. So we have this mantra of trying to communicate geospatial without using the term geospatial. That's not always easy, but what we find is that we need to find out what's relevant to that particular audience. And in the business sector, they're driven by the economies, they're driven by the ability to create a product by which results in profit. So we're in the throes now of redefining the role of government. And we heard a question today in the GeoBiz plenary this morning about what is the role of government. And I think it's true that we need to think about how we reshape our educational systems, how we provide opportunities for innovation. And one of the things that we've done in this past administration is the OpenGov initiative, an open data initiative, which is allowing the agencies to expose their data, to the point Barbara's making, sharing that data, to give folks an opportunity to repurpose it and to provide value-added products that can be then utilized. So I think the paradigm has shifted quite a bit in terms of the government's role as a user versus a provider. We used to provide a lot of data over the years, and now we're starting to see that we're becoming more of a user of that data. And the commercial sector has a significant role in providing that data and information because they're collecting it for a number of purposes, but we're also seeing that there's value to government and how we use that data as well.
But you mentioned education, and we all know whatever we learn in school, we take through to the rest of our lives. We try not to forget it as well. And I'm very conscious that in many countries around the world, we are not investing heavily enough in, at our level, helping young people to absolutely understand the power of place. And certainly in some countries, there have been some excellent initiatives. In my own country, the United Kingdom, we had an initiative where every school child, back in the 2000s, obviously wouldn't probably be appropriate now, received a paper map that they could take home that was based entirely around their home, and 7 parts of the curricula were adapted for it to be used, because it was a resource that came into school, and all of a sudden everybody wanted to use it, whether it was in history, whether it was in geography, whether it was in community studies, whether it was in politics. So, how can we be more innovative? We're here in the digital age. It's easy to get resources, but how can we help those very, very pressurized teachers to understand that we really do think this is something that is life-changing? And also, we are lucky in today's world. Every child, when they're old enough to have a mobile phone, has geography within it, whereas that wasn't the case 20 years ago. But actually, understanding and doing more with that geography than just geolocate where the nearest cinema is or the nearest store is something I'd like to see us doing more. Understanding how it can affect us in the environment, how it can affect us in scarce resource management, how it can help everyone get a job even. So
one of the things that we're doing is that we're working with our Department of Education to begin to include the geosciences in the Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics Initiative in the United States. So they've asked us to sort of provide them with some recommendations on what can be included, begin to start it at the kindergarten age up to grade 12. In addition, we're also working with our Department of Labor to begin to include core competencies for the geosciences as well, so that folks who choose to become educated and pursue that particular profession, there are now categories by which they can be qualified for certain positions and jobs in the federal government. So those are 2 areas I think that, while we're starting small, I think that we'll make some inroads over the long run, but there are a couple of things that we're doing in those particular areas.
Now, Greg, I detect you might be from the Southern Hemisphere. I think I recall you're a Kiwi actually, but you also have worked in Australia. You also have this global role. What more do you think we can do to help young people engage? Because we're going to be shorter workforce with this explosion that we're seeing across the world. We need more people trained than ever before. And there's well-paid jobs for them, but only if they even know that we exist.
No, it's a good question, and Ivan's picked up some really proactive approaches to how you deal with that within schools. And I think there's two parts to it. In fact, there's three parts to it. One you mentioned too is the fact that today youth understand their devices. They're walking around with technology at their fingertips, so to speak, as opposed to a map in past times, which we did. And part of that too is, as you may remember, in the old days, we would go and do geography at school. And once it's one of the sciences that we did at school. And once we finished that, we would maybe go off into undergraduate, and we will pursue different paths in that area. It's become a lot more complicated than that nowadays, in that, firstly, geography within schools isn't so novel anymore, and it's trying to balance with other competing priorities. So the types of efforts that Ivan's talking about in the US are absolutely paramount. I think the next step then is, what do we do, or how do we engage or attract potential university students once they actually leave high school? And certainly coming from a perspective in Australia and New Zealand, for a fair while that was really difficult, because in my area was in the earth sciences, and as Ivan mentioned, in terms of the geosciences, and that wasn't really attractive for a lot of potential candidates. But what we're seeing now is, as I guess geospatial information becomes more embedded into different career paths, and the fact that when you think of not only the geosciences, but engineering and architecture, other earth sciences areas, environmental science, and other professional career paths that actually have geography or geospatial information embedded in them, has become, in one sense, a strength, but in another sense, it becomes a secondary part to that education process. And so when you start thinking of specialised areas, and I'll use geodesy as an example, one of the big challenges
geodesy?
Geodesy
what is geodesy?
That's another one. It's very much
That's
about understanding the behaviour of the Earth.
The behaviour of the Earth.
And positioning. So where the...
Isn't it about where the exact position is? That sort of a
That's a loose term.
That's a loose term.
But you're right, it's actually a science in itself.
And it's all about the curvature?
The curvature and rotation and shape of the Earth, where we sit on it, in terms of the fact that tectonic plates do move, countries move around. We are a dynamic world.
So you're now making geodesy sound exciting.
It is.
Which it is.
But it's also a lot of maths in it.
Okay.
And here's another challenge, is that in our days, core mathematics was very important in our geography. And in today's time, core mathematics isn't so strong with students. So it's a different world. But it's important that we first of all we bring people into the post high school era of geospatial information, but also that it's also not just dominated by one gender. The fact that I know that 15 or so years ago, it was only an interest to boys, to guys.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing now more and more is being able to attract a lot more girls into the process. And so we're actually seeing a turn. So in terms of the geospatial sciences, and then that gets broken up into areas like geomatics, and as I said, geodesy, and urban design, and other different areas, that's growing. It is starting to grow. And so we need to take advantage of that.
One of the things I think we've also got to think about is, how can we get computer scientists? Because we really do need to attract that side for this fantastic kind of amount of development that's required to make it simple, and app developers. So it's really quite it's a really attractive industry if we can just get those simple words right.
Well, there's just one other thing, maybe just building on your last point, particularly as we're thinking about big data and just the sheer volume of data that's coming in, whether it's from satellites or sensors, then your computer technology comment is really relevant. But just going back to education one more time, because I was struck when you said about the UK handing out maps to young children. If we think about really young children, maybe even preschool or certainly in the very earliest of our elementary years, geography is an intricative science. They're really, it is pulling, it just integrates everything. And I think when you think about these really young kids, their brains work that way. They're just little sponges and they want to see connections that exist in the world. And so geography is ideal for that. But as soon as we start moving through our educational system and getting technical depth, we start to go into our silos. And then I think our challenge is, as geospatial professionals, is how do we start weaving it back together and pulling it back together when in fact much of our educational background has been a disaggregation rather than an integration.
Very, very true. So Ivan.
Just to build on that, I think it's important that we do begin to nurture those next generations. And we've heard this phrase a number of times that our young people are digital natives while we're digital immigrants. They grow up with this, well, we're adapting to it. So they think differently. And I think, if you think about paper maps, that's foreign to them. They're more in tune to maybe digital maps. So maybe that's something that we can begin to share with them and also make it relevant. Show them, their homes, show them their schools, and show them where they play. And that sort of relates them in a way that sort of drives them to want more, to thirst for more data, to thirst for more of the applications and services, more so than the data. So I think that's something that we need to think differently, because they think differently, and with that though, they get a lot more creative too in terms of how they use that information, how they're starting to use this information to plan the family trips. The parents are like, wow, they're amazed. And we've seen this with the recreation.gov initiative, where we're promoting America's youth to utilize the national parks and providing them with tools by which they can identify where the parks are and how they can navigate through those parks. So it's just amazing to see how, as you've said, how thirsty they are for this information and data, and how creative they can be, as they learn more how to use it.
Well, I've been very pleased that the British government decided that when we stopped giving paper maps, that they would make sure that all the digital assets were available both in schools and in universities. So on any day, probably about 1 million people are affected by being able to use it in the youth community. So just to finish, I talked about 12 months, 24 months away, and I'm going to ask if I could have the indulgence of inviting you back in, say, 12 months' time to re-look at this. But what are you personally going to do to make a difference in the next 12 months?
Certainly coming from the perspective of the United Nations and UNGGIM. So if I maybe take a bit of a global perspective, what are we hoping to do in the next 12 to 24 months in terms of this outreach and communication? We have a couple of important triggers for our community at the moment. One is, and it was talked about just briefly this morning at the GeoBiz plenary, was the fact that we have a lot of issues around in our global development in the world, and the United Nations, through all of the member states, have just agreed on a 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Now, embedded in that agenda is the need to measure and monitor outcomes and progress using geospatial information and Earth observations. It's very clearly articulated both in the outcome document but also in what we term as the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So this has just happened in the last 2 weeks, and this will be endorsed by the member states.
That's the prime ministers and presidents.
It is. We will have in New York at the Sustainable Development Summit at the end of September, we will have all of the heads of state and the Pope will be in New
Wow.
York for the summit to actually sign this document.
And geolocation or
Geospatial information
It's
is
in the
embedded in
document.
that as
It's-
a fundamental need on data.
so it's in the document.
It is in the document.
Fabulous.
The challenge for us now is to act upon that. And in terms of the need to measure and monitor, using good, reliable data, statistical data, geospatial data, Earth observation data, is going to be paramount, particularly in reporting progress from a national to a global scale. And so, this actually takes place on the 1st of January 2016. So the new development agenda starts on 1st of January. So we go from a proposal to an implementation, kind of like a trigger,
And this is
very
up to
quickly.
2030.
2030.
Okay.
And so it's incumbent amongst our community, our global professional community, to actually start providing and thinking about the data in terms of decision making, in terms of outcomes, and how it is used to measure and monitor progress on all of these areas around geography.
So you personally are going to be championing this?
We have a mandate to champion. But
Not
what's
I
important?
want to hear you. A
Well,
champion.
of course.
Excellent. I'm going
But
to
what's
ask,
important is that when you say come back in 12 months or 24 months, we will only be starting to formalise that journey in the next 12 months, because we have to develop an indicator framework.
But
So
making a difference
we're on the
every
way.
day is really important
We're on
in
the
this
journey.
agenda. I'm going to ask Bob, just give me that punchy line, Bob, as to what you're going to do over the next 12 months.
Actually, I've got 3 things that I'm going to personally do, Vanessa. One is I'm going to continue to use this convening power that the Group on Earth Observations has to reinforce the efforts of UNGGIM, because what you were just talking about of the role of Earth observations and geospatial information for the Sustainable Development Goals is essential, and continue to support the national efforts in organizations like Ivan is in, because it needs to be both bottom up and top down. Okay, I'm going to personally continue to advocate for broad open data policies, because without that, we aren't going to get the information to tie into the Sustainable Development Goals. And then lastly, and maybe most specifically for this conference, the GeoBiz Summit, is we in the Group on Earth Observations, and I personally am going to really advocate for clarity clarity on how the private sector can more meaningfully engage. We have been talking about this for, I don't even know, Ivan's associated with Geo also, too long. Yeah. And just because of many differences globally, we just haven't been able to deliver a true governance structure for the private sector, and we've just got to get that wrapped up in the next 12 to 24 months.
Ivan, you have the last word.
Well, just to build on that, as Barbara said, for us in developing the spatial data infrastructure for the U.S., it is bottom up and top down. So my goal is to, over the next 12 months, ensure that our current instance of the geospatial platform has political support. Now, we all know that in the U.S. we're about to have an election next year, and for us that's very important to be able to maintain the momentum that we have in the transition of the administration, no matter which party is in play. So it's important or key for me to ensure that we make the business case that this is something that they can utilize, no matter who they are, to really conduct spatial governance, as we like to say, in the U.S. The other thing is that my goal is to double the number of data sets that we currently have available on the platform, and have our agencies expose that wonderful information that they have that can be repurposed and reutilized by the community.
Well, if I could thank you all, I think you covered the topic of outreach and engagement strategies brilliantly, but I am going to hold you to what you've said, and look forward to having a similar panel in 12 months' time when we can review our progress and ensure that we're making a difference every day in getting location, place-based information into the hands of the right people, and truly everyone's able to say everything happens somewhere. Thank you very much.
That's true. Thank you, Vanessa.